Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, in turning down Golda Meir's request for arms to defend her country, is reported to have said, "Let the Israelis bleed a little." Golda Meir is desperate. Without help, Israel will not survive many more days of the pounding assault from all sides, despite all the Kahalanis and those like him who are bravely defending their homeland and sacrificing their lives on all the front lines.
Mother's message, Hannah Nixon's foreign policy advice. I have been watching a series online called Against All Odds, Israel Survives. While I find the premise of the series a bit silly, a reporter who is searching to find out whether miracles are real, each 27-minute episode highlights a fascinating piece of Israel's history. The segment featuring the Yom Kippur War of 1973 included an amazing snippet. In 1973, Israel was unprepared when Egypt and Syria both launched massive attacks. 1,400 Syrian tanks faced 189 Israeli tanks in the north, and similar imbalances loomed on the southern Egyptian front. Looking at it rationally, the country's chance for survival seemed hopeless. In desperation, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir phoned President Nixon's private line in the middle of the night.
Hello?
Madam Prime Minister.
Mr. President, shalom.
She made an anguished plea for American support in the form of armaments. Acceding to this plea would mean ignoring the recommendation of the Cabinet and Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. On the episode one was watching, a documentary producer recalls President Nixon saying,
"I could almost hear my mother's voice. She would tell me stories and read to me from the Old Testament, the heroes of the Bible. And one afternoon, she said, 'Richard, someday you're going to be in a position where you can help save the Jewish people. And when that day comes, you must do everything in your power.'"
On that day, President Nixon, via his mother's training decades earlier, became God's angel.
Later that night, when Golda's generals came to see her and said, "We are on the brink of annihilation," and Golda in her own diaries wrote that she considered committing suicide, recognizing that she would be the last one to sit on the throne of David, to be a prime minister at the time when Israel was never going to exist again. It was at that moment she decided to pick up the hotline, and she called the president in the middle of the night.
In contrast, he said, "We want to be sure that Israel continues to have support." And I said, "I will not let Israel go down the tube." And I knew that under the circumstances we could not stand by and let the Soviet Union move in, and that would risk a world war.
What was so remarkable is that many political historians and experts of the time considered Richard Nixon maybe the most anti-Semitic president in the history of the United States.
Yes. And so she picks up the phone and calls the private line of U.S. President Richard Nixon. It is 3 o'clock in the morning.
"Mr. President, if you don't help us, the Jewish people will never survive." He said something interesting, if not strange. He said, "I could almost hear my mother's voice. She would tell me stories and read to me from the Old Testament, the heroes of the Bible." He said, "I put my robe on, slipped my feet into the slippers. I sat on the edge of the presidential bed. And as I was listening to Golda cry out for help," he said, "her voice became the voice of my mother." Now, Richard grew up in Whittier, California. His mother was a devout Quaker. And he told this story that every afternoon when he came home from school, before he could go out and play, before he did his chores, his mother would read him stories from the Old Testament. And he said while he was hearing Golda's voice, he recalled the moments at his mother's knee. And one afternoon, she looked at Richard after reading a story from the Old Testament. she gave him a prophetic word. Richard, someday you're going to be in a position of enormous power. And in that moment, the Jews are going to need you. And you must now do everything you can to save the Jews. And he said, in that moment, while I was talking to Golda on the phone, I realized why I had become president for this moment. And that changed the course of history. And instead of being the extinction of the Jews in the Yom Kippur War, Richard Nixon became a part of the salvation of the Jewish people.